I froze when the homeless veteran looked straight at me and whispered the childhood nickname nobody had called me in more than 20 years. Mikey, is that really you? I couldn't move. That name belonged to a little boy I barely remembered, and to a part of my family I thought was long gone. The man beside the bus station bench smiled sadly and asked me to sit down. I should have walked away. Instead, I sat. Before I continue, if you enjoy emotional family stories where secrets finally come to light, subscribe to Family Betrayal. And just so you know, the faces, photos, backgrounds, and scenes shown with this story are visual representations created to help imagine what happened. The veteran introduced himself as Daniel. His clothes were worn, his hands shook slightly, but his eyes were strangely familiar. He asked if my father was still alive. My stomach tightened. How do you know my father? Daniel looked down. Because your father once saved my life. I laughed nervously, thinking he had mistaken me for someone else. Then he mentioned my old neighborhood, the little blue house where I grew up, and even the broken swing in our backyard. Those weren't guesses. He knew things only someone from my childhood could know. Then Daniel reached into his battered backpack and pulled out an old photograph. The moment I saw it, my entire body went cold. It showed my father standing beside another young man in military uniform. That man was Daniel, but there was something written on the back of the photograph that made me question everything I had ever been told about my family. And suddenly, I understood why Daniel had been waiting for me. I just didn't understand why my father had spent decades hiding his existence. Daniel turned the photograph over and handed it to me. On the back, in my father's handwriting, were 6 words: "If anything happens to me, find him." My heart started pounding. My father wrote that. Daniel nodded. Your father wasn't the man you think he was. I wanted to get angry, but I was too confused. Daniel told me that years ago, he and my father had served together. After leaving the military, they stayed close. Daniel even visited our home when I was little. That explained the nickname. You used to sit on my lap, Daniel said. Your father called you Mikey. You hated vegetables and cried whenever your mother made you eat peas. I stared at him. Nobody knew that. Then Daniel told me something that changed the story completely. My father had once discovered that a relative was secretly stealing money from the family business. When my father confronted him, the man threatened to destroy our family. According to Daniel, my father protected me by cutting Daniel out of our lives. He believed keeping Daniel away would keep me safe. But why did my father never tell me? I asked. Daniel's face became heavy. Because he was afraid you would look for me. I felt betrayed by a man who had been gone for years. Then Daniel reached into his bag again. This time, he pulled out a sealed envelope. My name was written across the front in my father's handwriting. I couldn't open it. My hands were shaking too badly. Daniel quietly said, "Your father asked me to give you this only when you were old enough to understand what he had done." I finally tore the envelope open. The first sentence made my blood run cold. "Son, if you're reading this, someone in our family has lied to you for years." And suddenly, I realized Daniel wasn't the only person who had been waiting for this moment. I read the letter twice before I could understand it. My father admitted that our family's biggest betrayal had happened years before I was old enough to remember. Someone close to us had taken money, forged documents, and blamed Daniel for the missing funds. My father had believed Daniel was innocent. But he couldn't prove it. So Daniel lost everything. His career, his reputation, his home. And my father carried the guilt. Then came the part that hurt the most. My father wrote that the person responsible was still connected to our family. I immediately thought of my uncle. He had always been the loudest voice whenever anyone mentioned Daniel. He called him a liar. He told us Daniel had abandoned everyone. I suddenly remembered something from childhood. My uncle had once screamed at my father, "If you bring that man back, I'll make sure your son pays for it." I had forgotten those words. Until that moment, I called my uncle. He answered casually, but when I mentioned Daniel's name, his voice changed. "Where did you hear that name?" That question told me everything. I asked him about the old business records. Silence. Then he said, "Your father should have taken that secret to his grave." My hands went numb. Daniel had been telling the truth. But there was one more secret. My uncle admitted that after my father died, he had destroyed several documents that could have cleared Daniel's name. He had spent years making sure nobody knew what happened. I looked at Daniel. He wasn't smiling. He simply said, "Your father wanted you to know the truth, but he also wanted you to choose what to do with it." For the first time, I understood that revenge wasn't really what I wanted. I wanted my father's promise kept. But before I could decide, Daniel handed me one final document. It was a legal record proving exactly what my uncle had done. And it contained a signature that could finally bring the truth into the open. Mine. I spent that night staring at the document. Part of me wanted to expose my uncle immediately. Another part wondered if destroying him would somehow dishonor my father. Then I remembered Daniel sitting alone on that bench, carrying decades of pain in a worn-out backpack. I knew what I had to do. I took the evidence to an attorney and made sure everything was handled legally. The old records were examined, the signatures were verified, and the truth finally came out. My uncle had no explanation. For years, he had told everyone Daniel abandoned our family. The truth was that my uncle had helped push him out. When I confronted him, he didn't apologize. He only asked, "Why couldn't you leave the past alone?" I looked at him and said, "Because you made the past part of my life." That was the last conversation we ever had. But the story didn't end there. Daniel was finally cleared of the accusations that had followed him for decades. I helped him find a safe place to stay, and slowly, he began rebuilding his life. One afternoon, he gave me the old photograph. On the back, my father's handwriting was still visible. Daniel told me, "Your dad never stopped believing you'd find your way to the truth." I cried harder than I expected. Not because I had lost my father again, but because I finally understood him. Sometimes the people we trust most can hide the deepest secrets. And sometimes justice isn't about hurting the person who betrayed you. It's about refusing to let their lie become your truth. If you had been in my place, would you have exposed my uncle or walked away to protect your peace? Tell me in the comments. Share this story with someone who believes family secrets always stay buried, and subscribe to Family Betrayal for more stories like this. The man everyone called a stranger turned out to be the keeper of my father's final promise, and I learned that sometimes, finding the truth is the greatest revenge of all.